Thank you for joining us. I'm Erica Rickard, and I direct a project at the Pew Charitable Trusts that is focused on modernizing our nation's civil legal system. I'm really pleased to welcome everyone today on behalf of Pew and on behalf of our partners at the Eviction Lab, and really delighted to introduce our guests, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and Louise Worthlin from the Tennessee Supreme Court Administrative Office of the Courts, Colorado State Senator Julie Gonzalez, and Mark Dodds from the Philadelphia Division of Department of Housing and Community Development. Now, this is a Zoom meeting, so it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without some housekeeping. So a few items. First, we will be having a question and answer session. So please feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions, and we ask that you identify yourself and your organization when you do that. The second, as you've seen, this event is being recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording along with some additional content and information after the event to all registrants. And finally, there's going to be a media green room for folks who registered as media, so please stay on after the event, which ends at 4 o'clock. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I'll turn to why we're all here, which is that today is June 24th, and earlier today, the Biden administration just extended for a final time the federal moratorium on evictions through the end of July. So we're here to talk about what's next. This spotlight on evictions right now is uniquely tied to the urgency of this moment, because evictions are both a consequence of the financial distress that families are experiencing in the wake of the pandemic, and also a cause of harms to public health as a result of the pandemic as well. But this moment is also a moment of opportunity for examining longstanding practices that can be reformed in the ways that landlords interact with tenants in our nation's court systems. Long before the pandemic, courthouse eviction dockets were characterized by high rates of default judgments, high costs to the system, to litigants and to taxpayers, and as we'll talk more about today, cascading consequences for all parties involved. So today, what we want to talk about is how we can harness solutions that are being set in motion that respond to the current emergency and leverage them for long-term improvements in their interactions between landlords, tenants, and courts. At the Pew Charitable Trusts, we understand that cities, counties, and states across the country each face unique challenges, and those challenges require tailored approaches to unique situations in your local community. But what we're hoping to do today is to bring together an array of voices who have all different kinds of approaches that they're taking that can inform local discussions that can help you determine what actionable, data-driven solutions can apply in your jurisdiction. So we'll start with my co-hosts for today. Speaking of the array of voices, we'll start with Professors Emily Benford and Peter Hepburn, who are going to walk us through some of how we got here and what we can anticipate as the CDC moratorium expires. Professor Emily Benford is a visiting professor of law at Wake Forest University School of Law, where she's currently investigating pandemic mitigation policies that affect the eviction process and can help preserve housing. Professor Peter Hepburn is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University, Newark, and a research fellow at the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. He's currently studying eviction filing patterns and the demographic characteristics of individuals facing eviction across the country. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Erica. I appreciate that. All right, so today's event is billed as an opportunity to look beyond the moratorium. As federal renter protections lift, state and local actors face both an unprecedented share of renters who are behind on rent and serious challenges associated with distributing federal emergency rental assistance. How can they keep as many households as possible stably housed? How do they balance the needs of renters and landlords? Before we start to tackle these questions, I think it's important that we step back and review how we got here. That means talking about where we were at before the pandemic, what state actors did to protect renters in response to COVID-19, and what effects state and federal protections have had. So let's start by talking about eviction prior to the pandemic. What you're looking at here is a map of county-level eviction rates nationwide in 2016. In that year, the Eviction Lab estimates that 3.7 million eviction cases were filed across the country. That's 7 eviction cases filed every minute. And that was happening when the economy was in good shape. Unemployment rates were below 5% back in 2016. So how did we get to this point? The root of the problem is the unavailability of affordable housing. Rents have increased dramatically over the last several decades, while wages have remained stagnant, especially for low-wage workers. Prior to the pandemic, almost half of renter households were categorized as housing cost burdened, which means that they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. A quarter spent more than half of their income on housing, and those shares are far higher for low-income households. Housing choice vouchers could, in theory, help, but only 1 in 4 eligible households actually receive them. Margins are they're really thin when you're devoting that much of your income to housing. And the typical renter has little or nothing in savings, no sort of private safety net to see them through in the event of a job loss or an unexpected medical bill. The failure to pay rent is by far the most common cause of eviction, and the amounts in question typically aren't all that large. Between 2014 and 2016, the median money judgment on an eviction case was $1,253. Because that total includes legal fees and costs accumulated during the court process, most tenants actually faced eviction for less than that. And nearly all tenants facing eviction do so without legal counsel. The Eviction Lab has been working to understand the prevalence, the causes, and the consequences of eviction across America. I want to highlight just a few findings from our research. First, the housing crisis extends far beyond the big cities that we tend to think of. This isn't just a problem in New York, in Seattle, in the Bay Area. We see really high rates of eviction in a host of smaller and mid-sized cities, as well as rural areas, especially in the Midwest, in the Southeast, and in the Sun Belt. 1 in 13 households is evicted every year in Tulsa, Oklahoma. 1 in 9 every year in Richmond, Virginia. Second, eviction affects some areas and some people more than others. Looking nationally, we've estimated that the eviction rates faced by Black renters are almost double those faced by white renters. Every year, more women than men are evicted, and we know that households with kids are at highest risk of displacement. We've also documented the outsized impact of a small number of landlords in driving the eviction crisis. Just a few buildings are consistently responsible for a large share of evictions in most cities. In Tucson, Arizona, for instance, the same 295 buildings are responsible for 2/3 of all evictions in the city, year in and year out. Third, eviction isn't always about displacement, especially in jurisdictions that make the eviction process cheap, fast, and easy for landlords. It becomes a default tool for collecting rent, sort of regularly employed threat that makes property management that much easier, but leaves a lasting mark on tenants' rental histories. So that's the status quo, sort of the crisis that we found ourselves in before the pandemic. And then COVID-19 hit and everything came to a screeching halt. And what happened at that point? I'm gonna turn it over to Emily for this part of the story.
The pandemic only accelerated and exploded the crisis. By April of 2020, more than 50 million people lived in renter households that suffered COVID-19 job or wage loss. And that loss affected people of color at much higher rates than their white counterparts. Initial numbers from April really highlight this disparity, as you can see on the slide. 61% of Hispanic Americans and 44% of Black Americans said that they or someone in their household had experienced a job or wage loss due to the COVID-19 outbreak. That's compared to 38% of white Americans. At the same time, according to a Pew study, over 70% of Black and Hispanic renters surveyed said that they lacked emergency funds to cover 3 months of expenses. So without a safety net, when crisis strikes, the downward fall is immediate and precipitous, and housing security is threatened. So job and wage loss placed millions of renter households at risk of eviction due to non-payment of rent. And today, the US Census estimates that upwards of 70 million people of households are at risk of eviction in this moment. So in response, governors, courts, and legislators issued emergency eviction moratoriums in 43 states in the District of Columbia and 5 US territories. This map shows the length of moratoria by state, with the shortest moratorium lasting 7 days and the longest now extending past the year mark. In adopting moratoria, governors and legislators recognized that eviction increases transiency and it leads to homelessness, and it makes it impossible to comply with pandemic mitigation strategies like social distancing or sheltering in place. As a result, evicted tenants are at increased risk of COVID-19 infection and transmission following an eviction, and that in turn endangers public health and increases the risk for the rest of society. The moratoria were patchwork in nature. Multiple actors created the state level moratoria. Courts were the first to halt eviction, but beginning on March 13th, 2020, courthouses in the majority of states closed in order to comply with social distancing and shelter in place orders, and they only heard emergency cases. This created the first freeze on eviction. They quickly reopened, though, by moving to remote hearings or to larger spaces. And at that point, governors and legislators exercising emergency authorities suspended forcible entry and detainer or eviction laws and limited the ability of landlords and sheriffs to pursue or enforce eviction. And that would displace renters from their home. The majority of state-level moratoriums lifted by the summer of 2020. And this was at a time when COVID-19 rates were spiking throughout the country. And in the absence of state action to stop the spread of COVID-19 due to eviction, the CDC responded by issuing the federal moratorium in September. So when that moratorium, thankfully extended today through July 31st, when that moratorium expires on July 31st, only 3 states and the District of Columbia will have remaining protections in place. Some states and cities, like those we will hear from today, have adopted an off-ramp or diversion programs to encourage or require tenants and landlords to apply for rental assistance before beginning the eviction process. The moratoria in particular had a significant effect on eviction and housing stability, and this is evidenced by filing rates.
So in response to the pandemic, the Eviction Lab began collecting eviction filing data in real time in jurisdictions across the country. We now have data for 5 full states and for 21 additional cities, which lets us monitor what's happening for over 1/5 of all renter households in the country. These data allow us to keep tabs on what's happened since the pandemic began, what effect these moratoria have had, and to offer some suggestions of what may be coming next. So what you're looking at here is eviction filings relative to historical average by month across all of the jurisdictions that we're tracking. You'll see that the pre-pandemic, back in January and February of last year, eviction filings were right about at normal. It's 100% of historical average. They fell in March as courts across the country started to close down and bottomed out in April at below 10% of historical average. Through the first 4 months of the pandemic, under the strongest state level moratoria and with CARES Act protections in place, filings remained below a quarter of normal. Filings increased during the CDC moratorium, but have remained below half of normal in nearly all months. These moratorium and protections, they haven't been perfect, but they've undeniably had a massive effect in preventing eviction filings. Nationwide, we estimate that over 2.2 million eviction cases were prevented since March 15th of last year. What do we know, though, about those who faced eviction during the pandemic? First, they were disproportionately likely to be Black. This figure plots the share of eviction filings against Asian, Black, Latinx, and white tenants before and during the pandemic, as well as the share of renters in each group. Let's focus on this second set of columns over here. The orange bar shows that about 20% of renters in sites that we're monitoring are Black. Prior to the pandemic, roughly 35% of eviction filings in these jurisdictions were against Black renters, and that number is almost identical during the pandemic. By contrast, nearly 55% of renters in these areas are white, but both historically and during the pandemic, they've received less than 45% of eviction filings. Second, we know that renters are further behind on rent than ever before. What you're looking at here are median claim amounts on eviction cases in 5 jurisdictions for which we're able to capture these data, relative to the median rent in the respective area. So let's take Cincinnati, which is in orange here. In January of last year, prior to the pandemic, the typical eviction filing in Cincinnati was for just over 1 month's rent, about 110% of median rent. In March of this year, that was topping 200% of median rent. In New York, in Philadelphia, these claims are now regularly above 400% of median rent. People who owe that much, they won't be able to repay rental debt, fees, and interest without federal assistance. And what remains to be seen is whether the available funds can be distributed to those in need. Third thing I want to highlight here is that those facing eviction are the least likely to be vaccinated against COVID-19. We recently published an analysis examining the relationship between vaccination rates and eviction filing during the pandemic. In every jurisdiction for which we were able to locate data, zip codes with the highest rate of eviction filing since the pandemic began tended to have significantly lower rates of vaccination against COVID-19. As we face the end of federal protections and with new variants of the coronavirus surging, that may represent a significant public health threat.
This is because without vaccinations, the end of the moratoria are strongly associated with the increased COVID-19 incidence and mortality. During the summer of 2020, in a study led by Dr. Kate Leifheit at UCLA, we compared the states that lifted their moratoria with those that did not. And after controlling for stay-at-home orders, mask orders, school closures, temperature, and other factors, we found that lifting moratoria results in a 2.1 times higher incidence and a 5.4 times higher COVID-19 mortality. Nationally, these results translated to a total of 433,700 excess cases and 10,700 excess deaths associated with eviction moratoriums lifting just during the summer of 2020. The mortality rate is likely more pronounced because the people at the greatest risk of eviction are also more likely to have health conditions that place them at increased risk of hospitalization and death if they contract COVID-19. And the catastrophic effects of eviction will not end with the pandemic. This is just the beginning. Without rental assistance and robust diversion programs and eviction prevention, 7 million adults and 1 in 5 children are at risk of eviction and the long-term negative effects to health and well-being. Eviction negatively affects every area of a person's life and results in a cycle of poor health and economic and housing instability. As you can see, eviction is associated with severe disease and several disabling conditions, including higher mortality, coronary heart disease, and just the risk of eviction itself, just that notice of eviction is associated with anxiety, depression, exposure to violence and mental health hospitalization, and suicide. For women, it is particularly harmful in that it is associated with physical and sexual assault and future housing precarity, which means that once you receive the first eviction filing, you're likely to see more after that. And eviction is particularly traumatizing for children. It's associated with emotional trauma, lead poisoning, and the permanent brain damage it causes, food insecurity, academic decline, reduced life expectancy, taking years off their life. For children who are evicted while they are in the womb or when they are born, eviction results in low birth weight and preterm pregnancies. So in this way, eviction itself alters the entire life course for the worse. So with that in mind, due to the permanency of the eviction record and the practice of screening out tenants with past evictions, eviction creates barriers to livelihood by pushing families to the outskirts of society. And also these outcomes underscore the urgency of preventing the crisis and protecting millions of adults and children from severe, devastating, and long-term harm. So now that we know what led up to this crisis and the risks to our community today, as well as the urgency of intervention, we will turn to the challenges and solutions in this moment with our distinguished presenters.
Thank you so much for highlighting just how serious the outcomes are for families. Let's turn now to the solution. So as Professor Benford and Professor Hepburn have described, the pandemic has led to a lot of temporary solutions, emergency orders, policies to temporarily halt eviction cases, efforts to move court cases online, and to provide rental assistance and other supports to tenants and to landlords in need. Our first state speaker, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, will help us unpack how those policies have been implemented and enforced. Keith Ellison was sworn in as Minnesota's 30th Attorney General in 2019. From 2007 to 2019, he represented Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Before being elected to Congress, Attorney General Ellison served 4 years in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and before that, he spent 16 years as an attorney specializing in civil rights and defense law. Attorney General Ellison, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Erica. Really glad to be here with you. Can't think of a more important topic to be discussing right this very moment. Absolutely, families are waiting on whether they're going to have a place to be and what this the end of this moratorium and quarantine is going to mean for them. In Minnesota, we started out with a robust executive order. The governor issued it and provided broad protections for tenants, which are broader than the CDC moratorium. My office was the one that enforced it, and we had to explain the eviction moratorium to a lot of landlords, but overwhelmingly, they went along with it. Some folks we had to take to court. We had around 12 people who needed to be sued before they got it. These are folks who said, well, I might not be able to evict you, but I'll turn off your utilities, or I might not, or I'm going to walk into your house. We told them that's illegal anyway. You can't do that, quarantine or no quarantine. But we took about 12 folks to court when they didn't want to listen to what we were telling them. But our first move was to try to negotiate and inform. But we did take legal action in several occasions, but overwhelmingly, most landlords were willing to comply. Minnesota's executive order not only prevented evictions, but it also prevented tenancy terminations. And by that, what we mean is tenants could not be forced to move into a new home unless they were in danger or committed serious crimes. My office, we formed an enforcement team, as I mentioned, and we were pretty busy. As I noted, we fielded over 3,000 reports from violations during the pandemic, and we sued around 12 landlords. We were able to keep many Minnesotans at home because the enforcement team's quick response. We had, you can make a complaint to our consumer division online or call them. We have people there on the phones all the time. And so we were able to get back real fast whenever we thought somebody's shelter was in danger. My philosophy and what I said to my staff is, you can hardly shelter in place if you can't shelter at all. And so we took that real serious. As I noted, a lot of the landlords just need information, but you know, some of them needed to be dealt with in a litigious way. So you know, the fact is, we've got to do all we can to stop the coming wave of evictions that is very likely after these protections end. Minnesota has coupled new legislative protections with rent relief. We have a fund of about $375 million in COVID-related relief money for renters so people can stay in their home. And we also receive money from the federal government, and we're putting it all together to try to keep people in their homes. By the way, we're not allowing landlords to price gouge. You know, once they find out that there's public money that's going to pay this rent, some of them get happy about that. We say, no, it's going to have to stay what it was. We're also right now at this very moment, and I am not exaggerating, at this very second, the legislature is debating the contour of an off-ramp from the executive order. And so to tell you what our off-ramp is going to look like, I can't do right now because they haven't voted on it yet. If we talk in 20 minutes, I might be able to tell you. But one of the things I can tell you that we know is going to be in there is there will be a 15-day notice requirement so that landlords right now, well, in the ordinary course, not now, but in the ordinary course, if you, in Minnesota and in West Virginia, we have a dubious distinction there. If you're late, they can hit you with a eviction notice. But under the new law that's being debated now, they will give you, you will have 15 days to, you know, correct. And so that's for non-payment. So that's a contour. And then that will be in effect for about till next summer. If tenants, we want that time period so tenants can apply for money, and that'll be critical for them to be able to get that kind of help. You know, we're also saying that landlords that use deceptive practices to charge their tenants more than previously represented, and who then use those charges as grounds to evict, make up stuff. We're not going to allow that. We're going to be very vigilant in terms of the amount of rent, the amount of security deposit, any kind of costs and fees, and no new terms. We're going to be very vigilant about that. I mean, historically, the Attorney General's office in Minnesota did not view tenants as consumers, but there is absolutely nothing in our consumer protection statute which exempts tenants. So we've been very active in the housing space, and we've been going after bad landlords because I philosophically believe that if you don't have a home, you are really in a world of hurt because it's hard to keep a job. It's hard to stay sober if you have that particular problem. It's hard you don't have an address. It's just very difficult. It's very burdensome on children, as we all know. So we prioritize housing. Just to move forward a little bit, although some of the evictions that are not justified and are certainly abuses of the proceedings, by focusing on just tweaking eviction proceedings, we will not solve the underlying problem, which is the lack of affordable housing. We've got to invest. Our message is, invest in transitional housing and shelter, but real housing at the price point that working families or non-working families can afford is really what is needed. Our country has not invested in public housing in decades. It is an urgent need. I think we ought to get rid of the mortgage interest deduction, put it into a mortgage interest credit, cap it, and use the extra money to build housing for people. And when you put together the work of groups like, I'll say Invitation Homes, I'm very concerned about the antitrust aspects of that business model, which is they're essentially buying up rental housing, putting it into a security, and then they're in a position to really control large numbers of rental units in a given community and can then push price. And we are very concerned about what that means. And we're looking at it from a monopoly standpoint. I believe housing is a human right. And I believe that our society has a duty and has the ability to provide it if we have the political will. And so legal mandate to provide housing does not mean free homes for everybody, but rather it means we can require national and local governments to properly fund resources to make sure everybody has a home that they can afford. And when they can't afford it, yes, we do provide it for them. That's what a compassionate society should do. So, so much more to say, but I'll stop right there, and I'll be around if anybody wants to ask me anything.
Thank you so much, Attorney General Ellison. I think we went from the kind of farthest upstream policy solutions to the kind of most nitty-gritty thinking about giving information directly into the hands of landlords about current policies. So it's really interesting to think about the kind of gamut of solutions. And while Mr. Ellison brings the perspective of perhaps an under-recognized actor in housing policy and in eviction cases specifically, our next guest will share a view from where those cases are heard and where they're resolved, which is the court. Perhaps more than ever before, court administrators have been actively involved in rethinking how these cases proceed and how courts can serve litigants. So with us today is Louise Worthlin, who's an assistant director and director of access to justice at the Tennessee Supreme Court Administrative Office of the Courts. She leads a team that oversees a range of programs, including access to justice, court interpreters, and the court annexed mediation program. And I'm hoping she'll be able to share more about what courts can do to be a part of these problem-solving efforts in this moment. Thank you, Ms. Worthlin.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So yes, I am in Tennessee at our administrative office of the courts. And we really started on the eviction issue through our Access to Justice Commission right after the pandemic hit. But then it quickly became apparent that we needed to use our power to convene and get stakeholders together to explore this issue, in particular stakeholders who may not always be on the same side of this issue. So we partnered with other state agencies, our Tennessee Department of Human Services, Tennessee Department of Health, Tennessee Housing and Development Authority, and we held an eviction summit, obviously virtual, in October to really explore how we could go about finding resources, learning about resources. We've known, but the pandemic exaggerated that we're all trying to serve a lot of these same families and individuals, but we're not really sure exactly what resources everyone can bring to the table. So that was one of our goals of our summit, was just to educate each other, but also we invited a large array of people to this. We had landlords, tenants, attorneys that represent both sides, housing agencies, advocates, mediators, you name it, we invited them. We have a big faith-based component of our Access to Justice Commission. So we included our faith leaders, anyone who has is a trusted member of their community who would be able to share this information. And we just wanted to, this was October, so the CDC moratorium was very fresh. So we were educating, what that meant, what the requirements were, how resources that were in existence for tenants, but also for landlords. One thing that we learned from my access to justice side, a lot of times we are talking about the tenant perspective, but for many of our legal resources in the state, we were getting calls from landlords who were really hurting, our smaller landlords, couples who may be having that as their retirement income, or, had inherited a property, we're just trying to rent that out. And they were having problems meeting their obligations because they hadn't been able to collect rent since the pandemic started. So it really shifted our perspective. And we started to reframe the issue in that we have to have everyone at the table. Again, you have to have the landlords to come to the table in order to try to divert some of these cases, in order to triage the evictions that are coming before the court. One thing that we did that we have seen some success and we're looking forward to continue to promoting is what we have called the ADR plan, ADR meaning Alternative Dispute Resolution. We have an ADR commission also housed in my office, and what we were wanting to do, that commission was wanting to do, was educate the judiciary on the use of mediation in a tool for the backlog of cases that we anticipate we know has happened, and we anticipate even more, especially in the evictions arena. So mediation has been a tool in Tennessee in civil disputes for decades, but we wanted to make a concerted effort to get forms ready for judges, for mediators to use. We had an education in January this year on the plan, and we've had 2 trainings since. One of them specifically was for mediators on how to do evictions cases. We have community mediation centers in Tennessee. They have been leading the way. And then our court annex mediation program has also been integral in this plan. And we even held a training earlier this month for our judicial conference on the ADR plan. So we're really promoting that as a way to again get everyone to the table and try to prevent evictions from happening. But one way to do that is we are connecting the mediation centers with the rental assistance. So our Tennessee Housing Development Authority is administering that in the bulk of our counties. We have a few of our more urban areas that have their own programs, but making sure that they know of each other. That's been a role that we've adopted, is just trying to, one, absorb every information that we can about resources that are out there and making those connections. The mediators, obviously it's difficult to bring a landlord at the table when they haven't been paid rent in months if there's not some type of rental assistance to get them there. And so we've been, again, connecting those mediations with those funding streams. We see ourselves in courts in general as, we're one of the first access points for people that are getting evicted. And so what we are trying to do through education, connections, making, meetings, summits, Zoom, whatever we can to increase our knowledge base of the resources that are out there, because if we can equip our judges and our court clerks and other court personnel with information on where people can go to get the rental assistance, how they can access the ADR plan, then we hope and we expect there to be better outcomes. It's more efficient for the court if those the appropriate cases for the ADR plan or for eviction resources, if they're disposed of using those resources, and only the most difficult and complicated cases make it all the way up through a judge and a hearing. Part of our education too has been, it was mentioned at the beginning, that there's a lot of default judgments in this arena, was just encouraging and educating people how to participate in this if they are facing an eviction, because again, if the court is the place where you're going to get access to resources, if you don't ever participate and show up in court, how are you going to access those resources? So just trying to make the connections that the court can be this convener, and it has that power at the state level and in the local communities to get everyone together and get everyone talking, and hopefully get both sides of this issue working together to realize that an eviction is not good for anyone. Landlords, tenants, courts, you name it. And so whatever can be done, again, to try to triage those cases and make it so people are able to stay in housing and landlords are able to get rent is our objective.
Thank you so much, Ms. Worthlin. As we're thinking about this availability of resources in this current moment and then looking beyond to thinking about lasting change, I'd like to welcome our next speaker. Julie Gonzalez serves the Northwest and downtown Denver as the Colorado State Senator for Senate District 34. She currently serves as the chair of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. She's the vice chair of the Judiciary Committee and a member of the Appropriations and Legislative Audit Committees. Senator Gonzalez was also a lead sponsor of new reforms to landlord-tenant proceedings in Colorado that both take into account the current public health emergency and also look to the future to encourage meaningful participation for all sides in an eviction case. Senator Gonzalez, welcome.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thanks to everybody who's taking the time to participate in this really important conversation. It's, I promise we didn't actually schedule anything with the Biden administration about the announcement of the extension of the eviction moratorium, but what a timely conversation for us to be engaging in. So, I just want to start my comments by sharing that let's not pretend that things were great for renters prior to the pandemic. We know that crisis exacerbates inequality, and particularly for Coloradans, and I think for Americans across this country, where we were navigating multiple crises. The pandemic itself, along with the economic impacts of the pandemic, the racial reckoning, the climate crisis, we were seeing the ways in which these multiple systemic inequalities were really bearing out disproportionate impacts on the ground. We saw that very much in the disparate rates of COVID infection and death. And we're also seeing that certainly in Colorado in terms of who was being impacted by falling behind on their rent and at risk of eviction. An important factor to note as well is that certainly here in Colorado, not only are we talking about racial inequities, but we're also talking about gender inequities. And so one of the big pieces that we were constantly talking about as through our legislature, our legislative process this year, was this idea and this notion that eviction is to women what incarceration is to men, where incarceration locks men of color up in disproportionate ways, particularly Black and brown men. Evictions really disproportionately impacts women of color, single mothers, single financial providers. And so I just want to name those things to sort of scaffold some of the points that I want to share with you all today. We, just to kind of walk through the timeline, our state shut down. We were in the middle of our legislative session, and we shut down in March of 2020 and reconvened in late May for an abbreviated COVID session. And even then, we were working diligently to try to codify our state level eviction moratorium into law, as opposed to leaving it up to chance through executive order or by no action at all. And I just want to be honest with folks that Colorado is a very landlord-friendly state. And when I first started having conversations with some of the lobby here at the Capitol, and I was proposing an extension of our eviction moratorium through December 2020, I was laughed at. Quite frankly, the landlord lobby was like, y'all think that this pandemic is going to go through December 2020? Ha ha ha. We were trying then to extend the eviction moratorium through October. And we in a Democratic controlled trifecta state, we couldn't get a state level eviction moratorium through our legislative chamber. So that's where we started in June of 2020. What we did see was that the governor did extend a limited executive order. And thankfully, the CDC federal moratorium really swooped in and helped keep Coloradans housed. What that experience last summer taught us, though, is that we had to work very differently in order to achieve meaningful action on behalf of tenants across the state. And so what we did at the tail end of that abbreviated COVID session, we did set aside $20 million in rental assistance funds, of which $350,000 were specifically allocated to eviction legal defense funds. We returned then for an extraordinary session, a 3-day session at the tail end of November, the first 2 days of December 2020. And then we set aside $44.5 million in rental assistance funds and another $500,000 in eviction legal defense support. And another thing that we did importantly in that bill is we actually set aside $5 million to the Workers Left Behind Fund for Coloradans who were ineligible for other types of pandemic assistance due to their immigration status. They had the ability to apply for specific targeted dollars. And so we hoped that that $44.5 million in rental assistance and the $5 million in the Workers Left Behind Fund would support Coloradans for 3 months. And yet what we ended up seeing is that those funds only lasted for about 3 weeks. What we saw as we approached then the 2021 legislative session is extraordinary need and a difference outside of the dome than what we were outside of the Capitol than what we were seeing being possible under the Capitol. So we realized that we needed to organize differently. We did a poll of Colorado voters and saw that this is wildly popular common sense policy. 80% of Colorado voters, when polled, supported changing late fees and supported putting a cap on late fees. We didn't have that policy in place. Over 80% of respondents, when polled, said that, yeah, housing affordability has gotten worse, and over 70% agreed that it was a crisis. And so that poll, combined with us organizing very intentionally along 3 different buckets of policy work, really shaped and transformed our ability to move policy this legislative session. We thought of things in 3 different buckets, as I mentioned. 1, supporting folks who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. 2, really thinking deeply about leveling the playing field between landlords and tenants in the eviction process. And then 3, thinking more intentionally about how we approach the need for building permanent affordable housing, not just in Denver, but across the state. And so we built a coalition, and I ended up running 8 different housing bills this legislative session. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I really do want to focus in on that second bucket that I mentioned, and that was specifically around supporting and balancing the rights of tenants and landlords when we're talking about the eviction process. Really proud. It took a ton of work and amendments throughout the process to achieve Senate Bill 173, which will really transform the eviction court process in Colorado. There was no, as I mentioned before, there was no cap on late fees. And as a result of this bill, which is now sitting on Governor Polis's desk, ready to be signed, hopefully any day now, Senate Bill 173 will cap late fees at $50 or 5% of the rent that is past due, whichever is the greater of the two. And that late fee can only be charged after a grace period of 7 days. We've also passed legislation, House Bill 1054, which allowed Coloradans, regardless of their immigration status, to apply for that rental assistance. That has also been really transformative and is going to really help Coloradans stay housed.
Thank you very much, Senator Gonzalez, and thank you for sharing kind of how useful it is to get a sense of what is being felt on the ground and how people are actually perceiving these policies when you're making those asks for legislative reform. Thank you so much. We're going to shift now to talking about city initiatives and specifically talking about eviction diversion. And by diversion, I mean programs that help landlords and tenants resolve disputes before they become full-blown evictions, helping tenants remain in their homes while also helping landlords avoid vacancies and unit turnover costs. Philadelphia's eviction diversion program has been hailed as a pandemic success story. It was initiated by the city council and has now become a collaborative effort with the municipal court and with community organizations. Mark Dodds is joining us. He's a senior program manager in the City of Philadelphia's Division of Housing and Community Development, and he's responsible for directing the implementation of housing and community development policy, programs, and grants. Mr. Dodds, thank you.
Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Dodds from Philadelphia's Division of Housing and Community Development. I'm joined here today by Melissa Long, Director of the Division of Housing and Community Development, as well as Kathleen Grady, Chief of Staff of the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm going to briefly run through some slides and then about the eviction diversion program, and then the three of us will be available to answer any questions. So to provide an overview, in June of 2020, Philadelphia City Council passed legislation mandating landlords to participate in the eviction diversion program prior to filing for eviction. The program officially launched just a few months later in September, and almost immediately partners began working often multiple times a week, meeting several times during the course of a week, and that work continues today. At the time, it was an unfunded mandate, but fortunately we were able to use CDBG CV dollars to cover program expenses, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. The program specifically was modeled after our nationally recognized residential mortgage foreclosure prevention program. That program started during the recession and housing crisis of 2008. It's been highly successful. It's been touted as saving over 15,000 homes to date. And while the new eviction diversion program required significant customization, to put it mildly, there was at least a framework from which to get started. Key difference being that the foreclosure prevention program evolved over many years, whereas the newly established program has been fast-tracked really to meet the needs of residents during the pandemic. Really want to talk a minute about partners. This work and the success of the program would not be possible without a robust and dedicated group of partners. I really want to stress that point. Those partners include nonprofit legal aid organizations who operate a hotline. They provide training and support. They review agreements. Just as importantly, the program is reliant on a connected and hyperlocal group of housing counseling agencies and neighborhood advisory committees. These groups notify participants of enrollment opportunities for rental assistance. They assist them with completing applications, and they also help tenants prepare for mediation. Volunteers conduct mediation sessions, definitely want to recognize that. And tenants' rights and landlord groups have a seat at the table. City staff ensure that infrastructure is in place, including the website, application portal, reporting capabilities, et cetera. And last but not least, have to talk about great relationship with the local courts. And really that's made it possible to get where we are today. The program, like I mentioned, is supported with $2 million in CDBG CV funds. That there is, of course, a concern that how are we going to continue operations when this funding runs out? And that is set to expire in September of 2022. So how did we get here? I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. The Emergency Housing Protections Act was passed in June of 2020, but it did not go into, so the legislation was passed in June of 2020. The mandate began in July, and then between July and September's, partners worked to design the program and get the program off the ground. Second here. So currently, that program was under operation from about, it launched officially on September 1st, and then it ran until March 31st of 2021. At that time, it was no longer required for landlords to participate in the program prior to filing for eviction. And fortunately, the courts swooped in, and on April 1st of 2021, they passed a new order mandating landlords to participate in rental assistance or file for rental assistance before they could start with an eviction process. That order remains in place today. It was renewed in May, and it is set to expire on 6/30, but we are hopeful that that order will continue and that they kind of follow the same trajectory that the Biden administration has done with extending the moratorium another month. Really want to say that the focus now, as far as the eviction diversion program goes, is really on connecting folks with rental assistance, and that mediation at this point provides the additional benefit of helping to resolve non-payment related to disputes, but the focus now is currently on rental assistance. So what are the benefits of court-ordered pre-filing diversion? The benefits are that connects landlords and tenants with financial resources and services available through the city. Those include rental assistance, housing counseling, and mediation. One of the strengths of the program is that it really serves as a tool, like I mentioned, to connect landlords and tenants to work out a payment agreement. And again, to that point, it really addresses non-payment and it keeps tenants in their homes. The pre-filing status preserves tenants' housing records, leaving them unburdened for, if they're trying to secure a lease in the future. And also, we want to recognize that it reduces the caseload of the court, which allows the court to direct its time for cases that can't be solved with financial assistance or mediation. So I want to show some stats. This takes us from the start of the program in September to just about currently. To date, there are around 3,500 completed applications. Landlords and tenants have, of those 3,500, 2,300 landlords and tenants have participated in mediation. And I think the number, it's not really on the slide, but really drives home the success of the program, is that we're seeing that when two parties meet, there is a 70%, if not higher, success rate. So two parties are able to reach an agreement over 70% of the time. In a few cases, there are, we do, one of the things that we I don't want to say we struggle with, but we need to work on a little bit more is dealing with no-shows. There are about 365 no-shows to date. That includes both landlords and tenants, although we're seeing the no-shows higher on the tenant side. So that's something that I think we need to work on. But overall, I think we're very happy with this, with the success of the program.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. I'm sure that many members of our audience will have specific questions about how they can set up diversion programs in the mold of Philadelphia's. We're also now happy to welcome Melissa Long and Kathleen Grady from the Philadelphia government, who are respectively responsible for administering all aspects of eviction diversion and for facilitating court engagement. They'll be joining us for the Q&A portion of the event. We're going to begin the Q&A with some questions that Emily and I prepared, and then Erica is going to ask questions that the audience is submitting. Please ask lots of them. The goal of this event is for state leaders in the audience to leave with a concrete to-do list of next steps for managing evictions post-moratorium. But before we turn to the panelists, we also wanted to pose a question to those of you in the audience. We're launching a poll now. Hopefully you'll see that momentarily. And we'd appreciate you taking a minute to respond to it. Basically, we want to understand how you all are thinking about potential solutions to the eviction crisis at this point. We'd like to get a sense, a sort of, a sense of the room and what you see as the primary focus or the most important area for long-term interventions moving forward. So we'll give you a few seconds to complete that, and then we'll move forward. All right, so if we could, if we can get all of the panelists up here on screen, and then if we could show the results from the poll, that would be great. All right, so a healthy majority see increasing affordable housing and housing voucher access as a top priority here, but a lot of enthusiasm for eviction diversion programs and the possibility of multi-sector collaboration, and encouraging to see about a third of respondents also looking at access to justice issues, things like right to counsel or increased enforcement of eviction law. So with that, I think let's turn it over. Emily, you'll take the first round of questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. So let's keep talking about solutions and also the barriers that you've all been seeing in your communities. So we know that the CDC moratorium, while it has a little life left, the expiration is imminent. So we'd like to hear all of your thoughts on the major threats to housing stability in your jurisdiction, and also how you're overcoming some of the barriers to creating housing stability. So I'd like you to think about that broadly, but then I also have some specific questions, Peter and I both do, for each of you. So Attorney General Ellison, thank you so much for your comments. My first question is for you, keeping in mind that we're looking at the barriers and solutions in the next couple of months. So we know that no solution will be successful if the people facing eviction are not engaged in its development. And you touched on that. That policymakers have to embrace historically marginalized groups and social movements as equal partners with an equal voice. Right. And that's what's going to help us with pathways for communication and enable effective enforcement. So how are you engaging that? You've done such an incredible job with enforcement in this arena. How did you build trust with the affected communities and inform tenants of their rights and even reporting mechanisms?
Well, we did a lot of community meetings. We held meetings at the Minneapolis Urban League, St. Paul Urban League. We attended, if anybody wants to talk about housing, we say, absolutely, yes, let's do that. I actually have visited encampments for unhoused people. We're, sadly in Minneapolis, if you drive around our town, you're going to see tents. And it's tragic and it's wrong, but it's there. And the city's response has been to put porta potties, which I totally understand. That's an emergency response. But we should just be building more housing. One of the things that we're doing also is that we are enforcing law against bad landlords, and that means talking to tenants' rights groups. We just finished a 2-week trial with a landlord who had maybe 120 properties. Every single witness we had was an African-American female, except for the 2 Mexican-American women and their kid and all of their kids. And one lady explained through an interpreter that she couldn't even use her bathroom because the squirrels had taken over the bathroom, and he had illegal release provisions. And I think he wasn't a dumb landlord. He just thought he could get away with it because he had been getting away with it. So we've got to enforce against these bad landlords. Now, there's a lot of good landlords who are glad we're doing this because their attitude is, I'm paying money to stay up to code. This guy, you let him get away with anything? So it's not an anti-landlord thing. It's really a pro-housing thing. So a lot of community outreach, a lot of community engagement, a lot of listening. We also got in the car and went all over greater Minnesota. The problems in the Twin Cities and the problems in greater Minnesota are different. One issue we have absolutely got to tackle is these manufactured housing developments. Some of them are great. Other ones, I mean, it's actually kind of a great deal for the landlord because there's this fiction that, oh, that unit is yours, you bought it. All they do is make sure that your plot of land is there. And they do nothing, literally nothing for the people who live in there. So we do a lot of community meetings with them. And in Minnesota, where we have meat packing plants and other agricultural communities where people just really do come in to work, a lot of these folks in these so-called trailer parks, they're not trailers, are really left out there. So those are just some things. Outreach, listen.
That's great to hear. And I think that also connects to the question that we had for Louise Worthlin, which, you discussed collaboration and conversation between the courts and a diverse set of stakeholders as a really critical component to the court's response in early on in the pandemic. I was wondering how you've kept those conversations going and what role you see them playing in addressing longer term threats to housing stability.
Similar to what AG Ellison said, like we go everywhere. We meet with everyone. We convene everyone. We are hosting things virtually. We are hosting things that might be promoted through a faith-based group, through the court. We see my office is at the state level, but then also again at the community level, courts do have this power to convene. I think if the court judge is going to ask people to attend a meeting, they will at least show up. And so that's what we are doing, is just trying to keep that open communication, having for example, we've done trainings where we might have had an attorney who's known for representing landlords co-present with an attorney who is either at a law school, at a housing clinic, or with legal aid, talking about how the importance of having representation and having this dialogue, how the outcome is better for all parties, promoting things like that. And just again, we'll go and talk to and meet with anyone who will have us right now.
Great. So I want to turn to Senator Gonzalez for the next question. You spoke about a whole set of bills that you were sponsoring, you were helping to run this last term. I was wondering what you see as the major legislative priorities in Colorado in the next session. What can legislators do, especially to challenge and to change that balance of power between tenants and landlords?
Certainly. I will say that I think that we've taken a great leap forward with passing Senate Bill 173, because it will pretty fundamentally transform some of the due process and bond requirements. For example, when tenants find themselves in eviction court and want to raise certain defenses prior to this bill being enacted into law, would have to pay certain bond requirements. We've eliminated some of that. One of the things that I'm really excited about is given this once in a generation opportunity that we have with billions of dollars flowing to the state, given the passage of the Federal Rescue Act, is we actually set aside as a state $500 million to think intentionally and creatively about our housing crisis, because it plays out differently in our mountain communities, in our rural communities. Think about our ski towns. We literally have small businesses who are having to shut early, even though we've lifted a lot of our pandemic restrictions, because they don't have workers who can afford to live in the towns at this point. And so those things play out differently in different communities across our state. And we will be engaged in an interim committee process to really think boldly about things like community land trusts, to think about policies. We did some of this this session to set aside millions of dollars to allow municipalities to buy hotels and motels. I called it the Sugar Hill Gang Bill. To let those municipalities support folks experiencing homelessness by setting up that transitional space as folks are moving from our streets into secure housing and into permanent affordable housing, right? There's so much there. And for a long time, I think we as an Attorney General Ellison mentioned this, where we have not intentionally invested in housing. And this is, we in Colorado are really looking forward to the opportunity through that interim committee process to bring all of the stakeholders together, to say, let's not pit each other against one another from a urban versus rural, or Dem versus Republican, or landlord versus tenant, or developer versus homeowner kind of perspective, but let's all get in a room and talk this out over the next several months, so that when we reconvene for our next legislative session in January, that we have some really exciting and creative solutions.
And that's exactly the type of approach that I think Philly has taken as well. It's such a good point about that collaboration and working this out in the Philadelphia program. And so I'd like to turn to Mr. Dodds and his colleagues. It originated in the community collaboration. It emphasized this pre-filing and really identified a key champion in the court system to mandate that and set the goal of housing stability, as opposed to settling cases. So you've already addressed so many of the challenges that other cities are just now confronting. What were some of the obstacles? What are some of the best practices? How did you really get this community policymaker court collaboration shift to address them?
So I'll start by saying one of the first obstacles we encountered was it was an unfunded mandate, right? So the legislation passed, but it wasn't money tied to that legislation in which to get a program up and running. It also came with a 30-day deadline to hold a mediation. So when we were designing the program, that was a major concern of ours. Are we going to be able to meet that tight timeline? There was also the tight time frame between when the legislation passed and when we were expected to get it off the ground. So that was really only a 2-month window to design and implement a program. I think that the success of that was dependent again on our partners, right? We would have never been able to do that without having a really close-knit, experienced group of partners that we've had the opportunity to work with on a prior program. So those are some of the obstacles. Some of the things we were able to do well, though, is the ability to pivot to meet the needs of changing circumstances, and that include, like an example there would be, we've increased the role of that housing counseling agencies play in helping tenants and connecting them with rental assistance, as well as our neighborhood advisory committees are doing a good job of ensuring that applications get filled out properly. One thing that we were super fortunate to have is in-house IT staff that could build and get a portal operationalized in a really short amount of time. I think that is something we've seen when we talk to other communities around the country. It's been a real struggle for them. And I think, next up and things we want to see going forward would, and this was touched on a little bit earlier, but maybe advocating for more housing choice vouchers out of the federal government, and really, I can't say this enough, it's a need for rental assistance, permanent, long-term sustainable rental assistance. I don't know if Melissa or Kathleen wants to add anything.
I think that though offers a nice pivot point, because yesterday, Senators Bennett of Colorado, Brown, Portman, and Young introduced the Eviction Crisis Act into the Senate, and that would support the development of a federal eviction database, as well as institutionalize emergency rental assistance for renters long-term. I think the original proposal is for $3 billion a year. And that would be potentially building upon the infrastructure that we've developed during the pandemic and using those mechanisms to spread funding. And I wonder if you all have thoughts about what you'd like to see or what the federal government could be doing to better support the work in your states. Jump in here.
Well, one, we need to appropriate a lot more money to just straight up public housing. I think the last time we put any money into public housing was during the foreclosure crisis. Even then, it was really just to fix up some of the decaying housing stock. In terms of new public housing, federally funded, we need it, and we need a lot more. We need it in nearly every state. We need reform, some tax reform to put, I mean, like right now, you know, we're essentially subsidizing Mark Zuckerberg's next mansion, you know, with the mortgage interest deduction. I think that we should cap that. And I think we should make it so that everybody can get it, whether or not they claim mortgage interest or not. And I think we should put the rest of the money in things like Section 8 voucher, you know, public housing, and other sort of programs like that. I think we need to have a big emphasis on making sure we don't have homeless kids. In Minneapolis alone, 3,000 kids a day leave a shelter to go to school on a school bus. This is terrible. You know, and again, I'm not against, you know, emergency housing, you know, we need shelters too, you know, but I mean, I hear too much talk about shelters and not enough about permanent, solid housing for people. And in Minneapolis, you know, if you got $2,500, you got a lot of choice in housing. If you got $900 to spend a month, boy, you are pressed to the wall. And we just need more housing at that price point for people. And I would say it's at a crisis level.
Just to follow up on that, I will say that when we were initially looking in this time last year in Colorado at the number of Coloradans who were at risk of eviction or foreclosure, right? We're talking of upwards of 400,000 renters alone. And we were talking about 61,000 Denverites. What we've seen just now is that 77,000 Colorado renters are now behind on their rent as of today. And so very much at risk of becoming housing unstable in the coming months. And whether that's through eviction or being pushed out once their lease is up, right? Because a lot of folks have been on month-to-month leases. And so I'm really proud of Senator Bennett taking some of the work that seeing the fact and recognizing the fact that we're in a K-shaped economy right now, and we're seeing very much a K-shaped recovery where the rich, in some ways, like maybe suffered a blip, but in a lot of ways, we saw the rich actually profit while working class communities and marginalized communities are very much still experiencing the real-time effects of the pandemic, and our policies need to reflect that reality, right? And it's why we are seeing such a tension between the like, we're over, let's just reopen and let's pretend that things are back to normal. When again, and I said this at the beginning, crisis exacerbates inequality, and let us not pretend that things for working class people were great prior to March 2020. Right? And so our policy response at the federal level needs to reflect that. I'm glad to see that we're talking about finally care as infrastructure. We need to talk more about housing infrastructure as well, because it's really hard to achieve economically or educationally if you are being displaced and don't have a current and stable home.
Thank you so much. This is Erica jumping in with some questions from the audience. We've gotten as you saw from the poll, there's a lot of interest in thinking about really upstream solutions when it comes to affordable housing and protections for renters. A lot of the questions that are coming in are around the mechanics and logistics of how diversion programs work, and particularly how they could work in the absence of something like additional federal funding for rental assistance, when this current moment of additional resources and additional attention has waned. Can eviction diversion programs continue to operate? Can you continue to incentivize parties to join? I'm going to ask Mark Dodds to start us off, but if others have responses to that as well. Is this something that we can think about as a longer term solution, or is it really just a meeting of the moment?
Well, again, from what we've seen, the success of the program is really dependent upon rental assistance. So I think it's going to be tough to have such a high success rate if that's not available. I suppose we would need to get very creative about how we're spending resources and working within different funding streams to do that. I think there would certainly be a concern if funding runs out about how we can maintain the level of success we once had. But I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add there, Melissa.
No, you hit the nail on the head. I think, look, we did a study, pre-pandemic, and 90% of eviction filings were due to non-payment, right? And we had a crisis, prior to COVID, 19,000 eviction filings a year. And really, I think the key, echoing everybody is, rental assistance, resources. We need resources for permanent affordable housing. We need Section 8 vouchers. We need some level of rental assistance to bring landlord and tenants together so that they can, come up with a way to stay in their homes.
Well, on the thread of rental assistance, we've gotten a few questions about how that works too. I think Senator Gonzalez, your comment about what you thought would last 3 months lasted 3 weeks. I think it's taking some folks by surprise, including someone in Hawaii who says they've only administered 20% of the rental assistance that's been available. So can you tell us more about how that allocation has worked out, and if others want to jump in on that as well?
Absolutely. I will say that for a long time, my colleagues in the legislature thought that I was really passionate about this issue because I live in Denver, and Denver is absolutely facing a housing crisis. But I want to say at the end of January, our Department of Local Affairs, who administers our rental assistance programs that we had established through that COVID pandemic relief funds, they actually put together a statewide dashboard where we could see that across our 64 counties, it was something like 59 counties at the end of January had requests who were pending and needing relief. And so all of a sudden, it became no longer just a Denver issue. It was, oh my gosh, okay, we recognize that we all need to step up, right? And so that data and the visualization, I'll post the link in the chat here in just a second, but that was really transformative and really helpful for us to understand and recognize. The other thing that I'll just name is that as we have to be thoughtful as policymakers about what information we're asking for from landlords or from tenants when they're applying for these dollars, right? And then how we are how we're communicating to community about the fact that those dollars exist, right? I mentioned previously that we were experiencing a tremendous disproportionality in terms of who was accessing the dollars and a need, but I represent a very immigrant-rich district, and we saw, even though folks may have been eligible, they weren't applying due to fear of an undocumented member in their family and whether that might somehow land their loved one in deportation proceedings, right? And so doing that extra work to ensure that we were communicating in culturally competent ways, making access to this information available in multiple languages, and then passing legislation to ensure that regardless of your status, that you can actually access these funds, these emergency assistance funds. To clarify that, I think has really gone a long way to help ensure that those dollars get to where they are intended to go.
Thank you. And I've got one final question for all of our government panelists, and we'll start with Louise on this one. But and the question is, if you could give advice to your counterpart in another state at this moment, what would it be? We'll start with Anne-Louise.
Sure. I know I've said it, it's like a broken record, but convene. I mean, when the Supreme Court, the Tennessee Supreme Court Administrative Office of the Courts asked to hold a summit, people will come. So just convene, and then take all the meetings that you can, continue to just educate and promote, and then also absorb all the information that you can about the resources that are being developed in your state. Reach out to, again, I'm at the state level, so reach out to the executive branch, because that's where the dollars are coming into. They're not coming to the courts. So we are trying to partner with our state level agencies who have access to these, millions and billions of federal dollars that are coming down, because in our opinion, it doesn't matter if the court system isn't the grant recipient, so long as those resources get to the courts where people are able to access them, both landlords and tenants.
Thank you so much. If I could ask Attorney General Ellison if you could share your insights for a counterpart in another state.
I would say absolutely convene and get people's heads together to figure out what we can do, but also argue for lawyers in eviction court. They make a big difference, and folks need that help. And without lawyers, they're just prey. That's the way it feels to me. Unfortunately, I have to drop off now, but I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. Stay in touch, and let's go house some people.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll ask Mark and your colleagues in Philadelphia, and then Senator Gonzalez will close us out.
I guess I would say having a great and open relationship with the courts is maybe one of the most important aspects of our success, and I think has gotten us to where we are now. So that's something I would stress that really touches on some of the things that Anne-Louise was mentioning earlier. And then I want to go back to the partnerships. I talked about it a little bit when I was going through the slides, but we had a group of partners in place that was experienced in this kind of realm and have worked together, and we've really kind of gone into overdrive, and we're meeting all the time and keeping open lines of communication. But we have 7 or 8 major players involved in getting this program off the ground and administering it, and it would not be successful without all those groups coming together.
Thank you. And Senator Gonzalez?
I'll just say that I think that we're going to continue to learn over the next several months about what the needs of community are, and they're going to shift. And as we continue to see the Delta variant now of the pandemic of the COVID-19 hit, and the way that plays out in community, we're going to continue to need to listen and innovate and tweak and be flexible and nimble. And so that requires us to continue to convene conversations with proponents and with opponents, recognizing that when we're talking about the hard moments, right? Like the moment when a landlord is like, hey, I got to file eviction paperwork in court, right? That is probably a rarity for that landlord, unless we're talking about one of those unless we're talking about one of those bad actors. Whoops, why is my camera turning off? That's weird. And oftentimes we're talking about renters who perhaps for the first time in their lives is experiencing so much financial and economic disruption that they're finding themselves in this situation, right? Certainly there were lots of people prior to the pandemic who were working paycheck to paycheck. But now there's a whole new sector of people who are finding themselves in this situation for the first time in their lives. Our policies have to reflect that. Our policy, our court systems need to reflect that. Our coalitions need to reflect that understanding. We got to treat each other with grace. And that's the work ahead as we continue to learn from this crisis.
Thank you so very much, and thank you to all of our panelists and to my co-hosts on the research team. I just want to leave our audience with a couple of questions to be thinking about as you're thinking about how you can apply the work that we're talking about today in your own community. But really just highlighting the fact that we have this range of perspectives and approaches that are being taken in every branch of government at the state and the local level. Even just reflected in this one panel really demonstrates for me that no matter what sphere of influence you occupy, there's something that you can be doing today in wherever you live and in whatever role you're playing. So with that in mind, I wanted to leave everyone in the audience with 3 questions. The first one is thinking about the way that this issue plays out in your own state or in your local jurisdiction. Do you know what the most pressing need is right now for your community? Do you have the data to understand it? Do you know where you want to focus next? The second question is, how are you engaging with affected communities to understand how to address those needs, where the needs are most prevalent and how to address them effectively? And third, as you're looking at models, we're going to be sharing examples from today. People shared examples during the conversation. As you're looking at those models and thinking about what's feasible and what's realistic in your local jurisdiction, to think about the range of stakeholders that's connected to the issue where you are and what you could actually reasonably accomplish and how you can make that change resonate with different audiences in your community. And if you're exploring what policy solutions might be best for your jurisdiction, please feel free to reach out. We collectively, my colleagues at PU and our partners here can help you understand where your jurisdiction falls relative to others and relative to what else is happening in the US. And we can assist with sharing some of the lessons that were learned in other places that might apply where you are. So again, thank you all. There is a media green room, so we'll ask media folks to stay on, but for everyone else, thank you very much for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Oh, I guess I think I'm on the screen, but
I can see you, Josh.
you can. I have the webinar thing blocking my view of all the video. All right.
The screen will come down as soon as we get all the media in and we're set and ready to go.
So we'll wait for folks to get on. Gotcha. we're just waiting, I believe, to get folks on in the room, and then we'll get started in just a moment for folks that are on. Okay, thanks for sticking with us, everyone. Thanks for joining. I know some of our government officials have to leave in about 15 minutes. So we'll just ask folks to either raise their hands kind of physically or virtually. We'll try and pick on members of the media to ask their questions. Please give us your name, your outlet, and the person you'd like to ask the question to. If you've got additional questions after this, we'll say this at the end as well, you can email press@evictionlab.org, or you can try myself or my colleague Rachel, rhooper@pewtrusts.org, or jrosenblum@pewtrusts.org. Thanks so much. And do we have any raised hands? Let's see. I'll just start at the beginning. I think I see the name Cassandra, but I think it might be Stephen Cassandra.
Hi, yes, that's Cassandra Stevenson. I'm with the Tennessean. No worries. I have a question for Peter. Can you expand on your point about a small number of landlords using eviction as kind of a default tool for collecting rent? And then for the other panelists, if that's something that you've seen in your respective cities and areas, are you finding that eviction diversion helpful in reducing that phenomenon, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that we've looked at the Eviction Lab. Be happy to provide a summary of this research. But one of the common patterns that we see in looking at eviction records is that we see the same households at the same address filed for time and time again. So, Peter Hepburn at 123 Main Street will be filed against for eviction in February, and then again in April, and then again in July. And this is a big problem in areas that make the eviction process particularly cheap and easy for landlords. So when it only costs 15 or 20 bucks to file an eviction case, that can be a really easy threat that landlords can use to encourage their tenants to pay rent as quickly as possible. So we see, I think overall nationally, about 40% of eviction, or just over a third of eviction filings between 2012 and 2016 were part of one of these serial eviction filing chains, where it was somebody who was filed against repeatedly at the same address. I'll turn it over to anybody else to talk about this.
This is Senator Julie Gonzalez, and I'll just share that we don't have a good data tracking process in Colorado right now about, you can see how many cases are filed, but we can't actually track in a meaningful way at the state level who is filing and whether or not they're even represented by attorneys or not, and how many of the filings actually then result in hard evictions. And so I would say that that's one area that we're looking to buttress and strengthen. But anecdotally, we find that to be the case in Colorado as well, that there are certain landlords who use the eviction process as a tool. And one of the things that Denver has done recently, the city and county of Denver, is actually they've just passed a policy that will establish a process by which, in order to rent, landlords will need to apply for a license, just to get a sense of who these landlords are, so we can get some baseline data to then ascertain and how many of those landlords are actually using the eviction process as a tool.
Thank you.
Anybody else? If not, we'll call on, I don't want to mispronounce your first name, someone Bond at the Inquirer.
Yes, thank you. This is Mikael Bond, residential real estate reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Mark, you mentioned the CDBG funding used for the diversion program. What are the options for continuing to fund the program that the city sees as such a success? Is that, applying for more federal funds or looking more locally, statewide? What are the options the city has to keep that funding going to sustain this program?
Well, I guess I would say that the CDBG CV funding is one resource, and it kind of was very timely to get access to those funds when we did. That we don't anticipate that they'll be around forever. However, there are other sources coming in now. There is ARP funding, or American Rescue Plan funding, is coming in that's targeted more towards a homeless population, but I guess that point is, I just want to illustrate that as a result of the pandemic, there seem to be additional funding streams coming in, and we need to be creative about how we allocate that funding. And I think that we do have a little bit of a cushion here, given that the current funding doesn't run out until September 2022. But we do want to be thoughtful about, when that time comes, I don't think we want to be stuck in a place where we're just not sure what to do and we need to figure it out. Then we'll be thinking proactively about different sources and how we can leverage those.
Anybody else have anything to add, panelists? All right, next up we have Christian Hernandez.
Hi everyone, this is Christian Hernandez with State Line, and I'm trying to, see if there's any, data repository or one place where we can see how the ERA money is being not allocated but paid to applicants. So, demographics, state, county level data of how this money is being spent and where it's going to.
I'm not aware of a national database, but Department of Treasury is collecting that information. So there may be an opportunity for a FOIA request. Some of the local communities have been releasing it. So if there's a particular city that you're interested in, the local city government has to collect that information and report it back to the federal government.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up here in Texas. I'm in Fort Worth, and I'm based in Fort Worth, and we're seeing disparities on how municipal court judges are providing information or mediating cases, I guess, to help tenants avoid eviction. So I guess, is anyone seeing that in other states? And if so, what do you think is driving these disparities, and what can be done to avoid inequality in evictions by court or geography?
I know similar patterns have been documented in Houston as well, where certain judges within Harris County have higher rates of CDC declarations than others, presumably in part due to information that the justices of the peace themselves are offering to tenants.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'll just add that earlier today, Department of Justice sent a letter to all state Supreme Court justices asking them to issue general standing orders that would divert eviction cases and buy time for rental assistance and keep these cases out of court. So I think that is one of the immediate responses to make sure that those orders are in place and that the legal system becomes the backstop in this crisis while we are working on implementing protective policies that could prevent the crisis altogether.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Katie Licari Kozak.
Hi, I'm Katie Licari, hyphen Kozak, with Capital in Maine. And I was curious about the particular data set about the evictions during COVID. Did anybody study the causes of evictions during COVID during the pandemic?
Yeah, so we're able to get cause information from some of the jurisdictions that in which we're collecting data. Sort of as you would expect, we're seeing an increase in the share of cases that are filed for reasons other than non-payment of rent. So that could be some sort of lease violation, or depending on the jurisdiction, you know, the specific codes that are offered differ. It's hard to say, though, how reflective those listed causes are of the situation on the ground, right? You know, landlords know that there are restrictions on filing eviction cases at this time for non-payment of rent, and it may be simply sort of a workaround for them to file under some other cause to avoid the restrictions on eviction processing at this time. Emily, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, Katie, did you say you were in Maine?
No, capital in Maine. I'm in California.
In California. Okay. Sorry, then I don't have a follow-up.
Okay, I know if any of our panelists are dropping off soon and have any final remarks, feel free to jump in here. I know we've got some more questions, but I want to give everyone time to add anything they want at the conclusion. Everyone sticking around for a little bit?
While we're waiting, I'll just say anecdotally for Katie that we've heard from housing attorneys across the country throughout the pandemic and the existence of the CDC moratorium that there have been an increase in evictions for lease holdovers or for lease violations that also had a non-payment of rent underpinning. So it may be indicative of trying to skirt the protections of the CDC moratorium.
Thank you. We've got Michael Casey up to ask a question.
Hi, how's it going? I just had a quick question. You know, the moratorium is extended for another month, but what are some areas of research that you guys are starting to dig into in terms of beyond, like, for example, when evictions do pick up, is anyone going to be looking at kind of who are the worst evictors, if you will, or what role corporate landlords have compared to small landlords? What are some areas of research that you're hoping to explore and that we might be able to, you know, tap into as in the weeks to come?
You know, I think those topics of understanding who's filing eviction cases at this time and over the next few months is particularly important. You know, from my perspective, I'm also really interested in understanding how the pandemic has sort of expanded housing precarity to new populations. You know, we knew that we have a lot of people who are facing the threat of eviction and displacement before this pandemic. But it's caused a real kind of broadening of hardship for certain populations, as Senator Gonzalez mentioned. And I think it's important to understand the sort of the geography and the demography of those who are at risk of losing their homes to eviction now and over the coming months. Emily, is there anything else you wanted to?
Yeah, I think two other areas that we're also looking into. One, we want to look backwards and see why the variations in the moratoria existed during the pandemic. So the Eviction Lab and I and others are examining the causal relationship that may have motivated policymakers to erode moratoria early before the pandemic resolved, or to be more protective, and how that relates to power balance and otherwise. Another area that there's a new data set that's being released mid-July by Legal Services Corporation. It will be hosted at Law Atlas at Temple University that will provide a 50-state overview of all of the laws, the state laws surrounding eviction. And so now that we know who's being evicted and who's doing the evicting, we can take a hard look at why that is possible and see which laws and policies are the most harmful and are allowing for the eviction to really entrench inequality along race, gender, and class lines.
What was that? Can you repeat that group again? That's going to be.
It'll be hosted at Law Atlas at Temple University. And I believe the release date is July 15th. It's Legal Services Corporation was asked by Congress to take a look at this.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. That's great.
And this is Erica from Pew, just jumping in to say, in addition to this really excellent landscape of the policies across the country, one of the things that we're hoping to expand is the availability of court data to be able to answer more of these granular questions around plaintiffs, who's being sued, where evictions are actually resulting in different kinds of outcomes, which is a real struggle across the civil legal system, but particularly with evictions. Professors Hepburn and Benford and others have done an excellent job of amassing some data from a subset of states and cities. And the more that we can expand on that, there's this new federal bill that might be able to create an eviction database, but even in the interim, being able to work more collaboratively with state and local courts to be able to unpack and understand what's actually happening in these court cases would really help us to be able to pinpoint what policy solutions are having with impact.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks so much.
Did you have another one, Michael? I saw you got your hand up still, but it's okay. It's just hanging out there. All right. Does anybody else have any additional questions? Let's see. We might have one. No? All right. Do folks want to give concluding remarks? And if any questions come up, we will come back to it. Anything additional?
Just thanks so much to everyone for sticking around.
Sorry, go ahead, Erica.
Just thank you very much to everyone for staying and talking through some really important issues and potential solutions to them. Nice to bring those things together as not just talking about problems or finding solutions, looking for problems, but trying to bring them together.
Thank you again to our great panelists. And Erica put this in the chat, but you can email press@evictionlab.org, rhooper@pewtrusts.org, or jrosenblum@pewtrusts.org if you got any follow-up. There will be a recording of this we can share within the day, probably within the next few hours, and we can email that over to you. All right. Anyone have anything else?
I just want to say a big thanks to Pew. Thank you. And also your support of the National Center for State Courts. They were very helpful in our work. So I wanted to make sure you got a big shout out for that, Danielle Hirsch. So thank you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Josh, can I just add 2 resources? Speaking of the National Center for State Courts, they've just released a diagnostic tool for courts across the country to evaluate what type of standing order they could issue. So we can share a link for that, which it's a really incredible tool. I think could change the face of the eviction court system during this critical time. And then the American Bar Association and Harvard Law School also just jointly released a report on diversion programs. And one of the interesting facts that they found, they surveyed landlords across the country, and 70% of landlords that they surveyed said that they would be inclined to address issues of non-payment of rent outside of court. And 81% said that they would not pursue eviction if they had access to cash or rental assistance. So it really is highlighting this critical moment of whether or not we're going to get that rental assistance into the landlord's hands on time before the moratoria lifts again. And then the last point I just wanted to mention, because we circled around it in the discussion today, is that if we're really serious about racial justice in our community and preventing the racial health inequity that the pandemic has furthered, we have to be focusing on stopping this eviction crisis. Eviction entrenches inequality along race lines, along gender lines, and the collateral consequences that we talked about today create a new system of racial segregation and exclusion in society. So we will see inequality perpetuated in a way that contravenes the values that we claim to embrace today. And so I just want to emphasize that what we do in this moment is so critical to the health, the safety, the well-being, and access to opportunity in society going forward. That's it for me.
That's a wonderful way to wrap up, unless anyone has anything else. I think we can conclude now. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to media who stayed on to ask questions and listen. And Erica, you can give the last word if you want. Just say.
No, just thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.